Victory at Yorktown. While the British were carrying out their southern campaign, key events were taking place in the north. In July 1780, French warships appeared off Newport, Rhode Island. The ships carried French aid. Thousands of soldiers commanded by Comte de Rochambeau. Eventually, Rochambeau joined up with General Washington, who was camped north of New York City. These two leaders waited for the arrival of the second fleet of French ships. If and when the second French fleet arrived, Washington planned to attack the British Army base in New York, which was under the command of General Clinton. As it turned out, the second French fleet never did arrive in the north. Washington and Rochambeau would never launch an attack on Clinton. Instead, both the ships and the troops would find a better opportunity to strike at the British. That opportunity would come further south at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington leaves for Virginia. As he waited outside of New York, Washington had followed reports of fighting in the South. In 1781, he sent Lafayette and Anthony Wayne to Virginia to stop Cornwallis. The results were positive. Lafayette had Cornwallis pinned down on the peninsula, a piece of land surrounded by water on three sides. The place was called Yorktown. Washington also got important news about the French fleet he was waiting for. The ships were heading towards the Chesapeake Bay instead of New York. They were going to join in the fight to defeat Cornwallis. With this news, Washington quickly changed his plans. He and Rochambeau would advance on the British at Yorktown rather than in New York. Washington kept his new strategy or plan of action a secret. He wanted Clinton to think the Patriots still planned to attack at New York. This, he hoped, would keep Clinton from sending aid to Cornwallis. Washington and Rochambeau then rushed south with their armies. Secrecy was strict. Most soldiers did not know where they were going. Wrote one, "We do not know this object of our march and are in perfect ignorance whether we are going against New York or Virginia." The French and American troops marched 200 miles in 15 days. General Clinton did not learn they were gone until it was too late. There was nothing he could do to stop the three forces. Lafayette's troops, Washington's and Rochambeau's army, and the French fleet from meeting at Yorktown. A trap at Yorktown. Washington's plan worked perfectly, and by the end of September, 14,000 American and French troops stood against Cornwallis's 8,000 British and Hessian troops at Yorktown. Meanwhile, the French fleet kept guard at the Chesapeake Bay. British troops could not get in to help Cornwallis escape by sea. General Clinton and the rest of the British army sat helplessly in New York. They were unable to help Cornwallis. The British were trapped. The American forces began a siege. They blocked off, which means they blocked off the British supply and escape routes. In this way, they hoped to force the British to surrender. Victory over Cornwallis. Siege began to take effect. The British ran low on supplies, and many soldiers were wounded or sick. On October 14th, Washington's aide, Alexander Hamilton, led an attack that captured key British defenses. Cornwallis could see that the situation was hopeless, and on October 19th, he surrendered his troops. The Patriots won the Battle of Yorktown, and they took nearly 8,000 British troops prisoner and captured more than 200 guns. At the surrender ceremony, the British marched between the rows of French and American troops. A French band played Yankee Doodle. This was a song the British used to taunt the Americans. A British band responded with a children's tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." with the mighty British surrendering to the upstart Americans, it seemed a fitting song for the situation. Independence achieved. The British victory at Yorktown was a terrible blow to the British in their war effort. Still, the fighting went on after Cornwallis surrendered. The British still held Savannah, Charlestown, and New York. There would be a few more clashes on sea and land. However, the defeat at Yorktown convinced the British that the war was too costly to pursue or to proceed with. The British and Americans sent delegates to Paris to work out a treaty. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay represented the United States. The American Congress ratified, which means to approve, the first draft of the treaty in April 1783. The final Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3rd, 1783. By this time, the British had also made peace with the French and Spain. Under the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation. The British also promised to withdraw all their troops from the American territory. They gave the Americans fighting rights to the waters off the coast of nearby Canada, and in turn, the United States promised that the Americans would pay to British merchants what they owed them. The treaty also stated that Congress would advise the new states to return property taken from the Loyalists. A conspiracy against Congress. Many months passed between the end of the fighting in the American Revolutionary War and the signing of the peace treaty. During that time, Washington was unwilling to dissolve the Army. Instead, he camped his idle troops in Newburgh, New York. Many of these soldiers believed that they were owed pay from the Congress. When this pay did not come, the soldiers grew angry. Some officers sent a letter around in March 1783. If their demands were not met, the letter said, the Army would use force against the Congress. Washington realized that this threat of serious revolt was dangerous. The new nation could be destroyed. And in a dramatic speech, he asked angry soldiers to be patient. Then Washington urged Congress to meet their just demands. The Congress agreed, and Washington's leadership ended the threat to the new nation. Washington returns home. In late November 1783, the war truly ended, and the last British troops left New York City. Washington could at last give up his command. The soldiers could return to their homes and their lives. And on December 4th, Washington said farewell to his troops. 3 weeks later, he formally resigned or gave up his position at a meeting of Congress. Washington said, having now finished the work assigned to me, I retire, and I take my leave of all employments of public life. Washington returned home to Mount Vernon, Virginia, and there he planned to remain and live quietly with his family. Why the Americans won. How did the Americans defeat the powerful Great Britain? Remember, the Americans had several advantages in the war. First, they fought on their own land. The British had to move troops and supplies across the ocean. It was harder for them to get reinforcements, as the siege of Yorktown showed. When their ships were blocked, the British troops had no support. Also, the Americans knew the land. They knew where to lay in an ambush, which is a surprise attack. They were experts at wilderness fighting. The British, in contrast, had much difficulty controlling the American countryside once they occupied the cities. The Battle of Kings Mountain, which you read about in Lesson 3, illustrates this point. The rural people did not like being told what to do, and they had wilderness fighting skills that could defeat their new enemies. Help from other countries contributed to the American victory. Their success at Yorktown could not have been possible without French soldiers and ships. Spain gave aid when they attacked the British, and individuals such as Lafayette and von Steuben came to America to provide vital services to the patriot cause. Perhaps most important, the American Revolution was a people's movement. Its outcome depended not on one battle or event, but on the determination and spirit of all patriots. As Washington remarked about the patriotic crowds, here is an army they will never conquer, which meaning the British will never conquer. In 1776, the American colonists began a revolution. In the Declaration of Independence, they outlined the principles of freedom and the rights they felt all people and nations should have. These ideals inspired people in other parts of the world. For example, French rebels in 1789 fought a revolution in defense of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The French upheld these principles. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. In 1791, there was a revolution in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Inspired by the ideals of the American and French revolutions, enslaved Africans soon took up arms, and they were led by a former African named Toussaint Louverture, and soon shook off French rule. In Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, became the second nation in the Americas to achieve independence from the colonial rule. We have asserted our rights, declared revolutionaries. We swear never to yield them to any power on earth.